I'm Sandy Baird from the Vermont Institute of Community and International Involvement. I'm here with my attorney friend and colleague, Kurt Maida, to talk a little bit about what is going on with the cases against Trump, against our former president, Donald Trump, with his comments and his thoughts on the legal situation facing our president and whether or not justice is being done to the president or whether it is not being done, I guess. So I'm going to turn to Kurt and ask him to first give a brief summary of what is going on. First of all, I'd like to ask you if you could explain to our viewers in the first place what a grand jury is. I mean, it's very unclear to me whether the citizens of our country even understand the differences between a grand jury and a petty jury. And right now, the Trump case is with the grand jury. Is that correct?
Right. So thanks for having me, Sandy. So one of the things that is being contemplated right now by the grand jury is whether or not the former president can potentially be indicted.
And which means charged.
That is charged with a crime. Now, the reason this is important, this story is important, is because there's no precedent, historically, no pun intended, precedent, for a former president of the United States being indicted in the United States for a crime.
Okay, none whatsoever, no precedent. No president has ever been brought to a grand jury or any jury for a crime, right?
There hasn't been an indictment.
Right.
I know that after President Clinton's 2 terms in office, there were moves, I think successfully, to have him disbarred as an attorney by the State Bar of Arkansas, where he was former governor and was licensed to practice law. But there has never been an actual indictment for a felony or for a crime in the United States for a prior sitting president.
Okay, so, and a grand jury is an investigative body.
That is correct.
Right, it's not like a jury, a petty jury, which decides guilt or innocence.
That's correct.
Or not guilt or not guilty.
Right.
This is an investigative tool that's used to examine and charge someone if the grand jury feels that a crime has been committed.
Has indeed been committed.
And there's probable cause to show who did that crime.
That is correct.
All right, great.
They're on a fact-finding mission.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so that is what's happening right now with our former president.
Right.
And what is the crime that is being investigated?
So, that's where this gets a little murky.
Yes.
The story that we've seen in the press is largely focused on, the salacious underlying activity that was essentially, for lack of a better description, the president allegedly had an affair with an X-rated actress in approxiately 2006.
So 2006 was when this occurred.
Allegedly.
Right, and he was not the president then.
He was at that point he was still just a private businessman. He did not hold any office at that time.
Mm-hmm. So what was this crime supposedly that occurred?
Okay, so the crime. So let's fast forward about a decade and a half, or a decade, I should say. And
so this is 2006. He becomes president in
2016. He was
correct,
he was that President Trump's prior attorney, or former attorney, personal attorney.
That was Michael Cohen.
That was Michael Cohen. He made about $130,000 in payments to this X-rated actress, Stormy Daniels.
Mm-hmm. As the press has this pornographic star.
Right. So whatever you wish to call her.
Right.
So essentially, it was termed as hush money.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean essentially? Who termed it hush money?
Well, the press has called it hush money.
The press is calling it
hush money.
Right.
Basically, in exchange for this payment of $130,000, that she wouldn't go to the press and speak out about the fact that she had an affair. The president was married at the time, and his wife was pregnant at the time. Mm-hmm. And the hope was, as the campaign was drawing to an end, the presidential campaign in 2016, that this story wouldn't come out and essentially hurt his chances for a successful run for president. So his personal attorney, Michael Cohen, paid Stormy Daniels $130,000.
So and what was the intent of the payment?
Again, it's been referenced in the press now as hush money to keep her
part
quiet.
of the press.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
But the payments, and Michael Cohen did serve a sentence and was prosecuted
Because
in
of
federal
that?
court for basically, the actions that were alleged. Essentially, he was convicted of violating campaign finance laws.
Okay, so let's for a minute not go there about the campaign finance. Okay.
Sure.
So allegedly, Trump gave to Stormy Daniels about $130,000
Through his attorney.
Through his attorney, which is a normal practice, isn't it?
Well, yeah. Let me go a step back. So the actual mechanics here were that an organization, presumably controlled by Trump, paid Michael Cohen, Trump's attorney, $130,000, which was then transferred to Stormy Daniels. The bookkeeping subsequently was re-recorded to show that these were legal expenses. And that's what was then later submitted to tax authorities, to anyone who was who controls Michael Cohen's trust accounts, that these were essentially legal fees. And that's where the alleged crime that's being that Trump is being accused of. Basically, not the payment itself, the act of the payment, but the fact that the recording documents subsequently were changed.
So what?
Right. So essentially, for record keeping, it's considered, it's a misdemeanor.
At best, isn't it?
At best, right.
Okay. So, and a misdemeanor is
under New York state law.
Under New York state law, and
Yeah.
a misdemeanor, to clear this up, is not a felony. A
That is
misdemeanor is rather a minor crime for which you can get not more than 2 years in the state of Vermont in jail.
Right, or no jail at all. For
Usually you don't get jail
Right.
at all. Usually
Right.
you have to pay a fine. Usually
Yeah.
maybe you would be briefly on probation.
Right. Now the interesting thing here
Okay,
is
so this then is considered a misdemeanor at best.
under New York state law.
Okay, what is the misdemeanor? Paying for her not to talk, or this other complicated thing?
No, it's more about the record keeping. It's committing fraud in record keeping.
So why, and the accusation is that he did that, Donald Trump?
That would be the accusation that the
Grand jury?
and that this Manhattan district attorney is trying to build a case on.
And that's Bragg.
That's
correct?
Alvin
Okay.
Bragg, right? He's a state district attorney.
All right, so what they're
The reason
saying...
I'm emphasizing that, we'll get to that
Yeah,
later.
okay, so they're saying that Donald Trump had bad record keeping?
Well, that he falsified records.
That he falsified by saying it was a legal expense rather than what?
Than what it actually indeed was. He also paid
Wait a
additional
minute, what actually was it then?
a payoff to this X-rated
To shut her
actress.
up.
Yeah, essentially a non-disclosure.
Yeah, but non-disclosures are done every day.
Correct,
right?
but this wasn't done in the form of a non-disclosure agreement. This was done, the allegation is in a backhanded way by this mysterious organization that was paying this attorney legal fees that were then, and also covered the tax liability on making the payment.
But he's not being accused of any screw up with the taxes.
That he is not.
Okay.
That's not the allegation. Remember, again, an allegation of him committing fraud in terms of the record keeping and document handling is coming from a state.
Okay.
District
So
attorney.
all right. So so what's happening right now with that?
So right now, like as you mentioned, this is a grand jury is examining this, and trying to decide whether or not they're going to issue an indictment.
And an indictment is a charge.
That is correct.
Okay, all
Yeah.
right. So, and they seem to be not coming to any conclusion right now.
That's the way it appears right now. So, although the press is given a great deal of attention to this case because of the fact that there's an affair essentially being alleged, and that there's an X-rated actress involved, and of course a former president being involved. What they're not really focusing on is the state of New York law as how it compares to federal election law, which is actually a very complicated issue here.
Okay, so what is that issue? So, what is that issue between the state and the federal government, right?
Right. So, in order for for Alvin Bragg, who is the New York State District Attorney, he needs to essentially prove
a felony.
And the way he can only do that is by showing that Trump committed a misdemeanor, that there was, in the process of committing the misdemeanor, that there was intent to commit another crime.
Right, which is a more serious crime, which would be have to be a more serious crime.
Right, and the allegation that Alvin Bragg, the district attorney, is making is that more serious crime, this so-called potentially a felony, would have to be a violation on the part of Trump of federal election law.
Okay, all right. So that's not an easy thing, right?
Not an easy thing. Number one is the district attorney is a state district attorney. This is not a federal action. The Southern District of New York, which is the federal adjudicative body in New York in that region, has decided not to bring that case.
Why?
Because they were not interested in prosecuting the case. Perhaps because there wasn't enough evidence. Perhaps
Usually
there
that's
wasn't
the case,
interest.
right? I mean,
perhaps there wasn't interest to prosecute.
The prosecutors always have to make a decision based essentially on whether there's probable cause, at least, to move forward. So somehow some prosecutor decided there wasn't enough probable cause.
Potentially not, or potentially there wasn't the interest or the resources to proceed with a case like that. So what we have here is a state district attorney making an allegation that Trump violated a state law, but in the process of violating that state law, also had intent to violate a federal law, which is the federal election law when it comes to campaign contributions.
All right. Is there any thought in your mind or anybody else's mind that that's a correct analysis? That somehow this payment was illegal?
A violation of federal campaign finance law.
How?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. So the federal statutes that govern election law basically make a distinction between what is a campaign contribution and what is a personal expenditure. So the district attorney of New York, Bragg, is going to allege that this was not a personal expenditure, this $130,000 payment, that this was actually indeed a campaign contribution.
To his own campaign?
To his own campaign, correct.
To shut her up.
To shut her up. Okay. That these were funds that were used that in furtherance of his campaign.
To get him elected.
To get him elected as the president of the United States.
In other words, he bought her silence to be successful in his. Okay.
So whether the monies that were used by this dubious organization, whether those were his own monies, and they were a contribution towards his campaign, and he's going to claim, his attorney is going to claim that no, that these were not campaign contributions; these were personal expenditures. So the federal election law has a very strict, guideline by which they assess whether or not something is a campaign contribution or a personal expenditure.
Okay, so what's the possibility of that?
Well, I mean, in 2004, there is some precedent here, not with respect to a former sitting president of the United States, but the former senator of, I believe it was South Carolina,
John
Edwards, had a similar situation that during the 2004 run of he and John Kerry to become president and vice president against George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, Mr. Edwards was having an affair with a woman at the time, and he was making payments to her so that the story did not come out
About an affair.
Right. During the 2004 presidential and vice
so there
presidential.
was a thought that he was doing that to win an election. He was paying
the
that
Department
money.
of Justice, investigated to see whether or not this was a personal expenditure or whether this was a campaign contribution.
And what was decided?
That it was a personal expenditure. To save his wife and family from embarrassment, even though it took place during a very heated, election campaign in 2004 for president.
And that was true of the Stormy Daniels matter also. He paid her during an election.
The payment was made in 2016
when he was
running for president.
All right.
So the best shot that the prosecution has is by alleging that this payment, coincidentally having taken place in 2016, was in furtherance of his presidential run, and therefore it should be classified as a campaign contribution.
So, what are the likelihood, I guess, of that?
It's difficult to prove. It's extremely difficult to prove that.
And he's arguing that it was a personal expense.
That it was a personal expenditure to save his family from embarrassment, if the allegations were indeed correct. And in the case of John Edwards, it was found, the Department of Justice did an inquiry, and they decided it was a personal expense. They decided not to prosecute him for violating campaign finance laws, which, in this situation, that's the crux of the case.
So the crux of the case is whether or not this was a personal expense,
right,
or whether it was a
campaign contribution. Therefore, this
to
would
himself.
Correct, towards his own campaign.
Yeah,
right.
And you can't do that.
No, because there are strict limits as to how much he can contribute.
Okay, all right. So what's happening right now? What's the likelihood that this is going to go anywhere?
Well, the indictment may happen because the grand jury.
That's on the state level.
Yeah, at the state level.
Yeah, but the indictment then can only be a misdemeanor?
Well, it's a misdemeanor. However, the prosecutor then has to prove that in the process of committing this misdemeanor, there was intent to commit a felony. The felony being violating, federal campaign finance laws.
Okay, so can that happen in the state court?
That's going to be an interesting issue that's going to come up. Whether or not the state district attorney has jurisdiction over this matter.
Does it?
Well, a court will decide that. I think Trump's attorneys are going to argue that this court, the state district attorney, has no say on federal campaign finance laws. There's a federal statute already in place that when federal campaign finance laws are being adjudicated, that only a federal court can make that decision. The state court doesn't have jurisdiction.
What's your opinion?
I think that this will potentially go away and be.
What do you think the grand jury's going to do? Anything?
I think the grand jury may indict.
But
the grand jury and ultimately an actual court. That's a different, I mean, the grand jury doesn't have the luxury of hearing Mr. Trump's arguments right now.
Correct, because he doesn't have to go to a grand jury.
That is correct.
Because he's the target of it.
Nor are his attorneys.
Correct.
So they are
they're not allowed, or what?
No, because the grand jury's right now they're in a fact-finding phase.
Right.
In which they may conduct interviews, but they're not interviewing Mr. Trump's attorneys.
Well, I would guess not. I mean, why would that be? I mean, why?
Yeah, it doesn't work that way.
No. Well, it doesn't work that way because Trump has the right at this moment to remain silent anyway.
That is correct.
He's not like any American citizen.
He's not been formally charged.
He's not been formally charged, and therefore he doesn't have to talk about anything.
That is correct.
Yeah. Ever, really.
Right.
Until he's convicted of something.
Until he's indicted and there's a trial.
Yeah, but he doesn't have to talk.
Not
to
himself,
trial.
not physically speak himself. That's correct.
And his attorneys don't either, right? Because of attorney-client privilege, or what's the deal?
Well, they can't disclose
Anything he told them.
he told them.
Right.
But they're probably going to argue their best case.
Do you think
In
so?
court.
The attorneys for Trump would have to appear in court? I guess.
Certainly, if there's an indictment. Sure.
I get that. Okay, great. But they don't have, because of the attorney-client privilege, which seems to be under attack a lot these days, they don't have to testify against their own client.
No.
Or say anything that he has told them.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
Okay. So what's the
I mean, so I think part of the conversation now is more about what this means for our republic.
What does it mean?
Yeah. So, in terms of for the country, is this setting a bad precedent?
Is it?
I don't know. Where we are in the business now of prosecuting prior administrations through this legal revenge methodology.
Why do you think it's legal revenge and not anything more accurate than that? Legally factual.
What do you mean?
I mean, okay, so if he did something that was a crime,
Right.
shouldn't he be prosecuted as
Absolutely.
every other American citizen? What are you arguing?
Yeah, I mean, no person in our country, we've decided, as a country, is above the law.
Correct.
Right. The claims that I think people that are supporters for Trump are going to make is whether or not, essentially, this is a vindictive act to try to bar him from running for president again if he's convicted of a felony. And
that would bar him?
That would bar him from being able to run.
Mm-hmm.
And whether or not this is a tactic to basically harass, someone that they support after he's
not only
been
harass,
president.
but knock him out of the race.
Knock him out of the race.
Right? Exactly.
Right.
That's really what they're trying to do, isn't it?
Right. And whether or not that, setting this precedent will not only potentially hurt Mr. Trump and the people that support him, but at a later date, is this going to be something that, an adversary of his, is going to also be subject to the same treatment? Are we essentially going to become a country where after you've served in government, you are
especially
automatically,
as president.
Yeah, or you're automatically going to be, indicted for crimes subsequently by the adversarial party.
In other words, is this political?
Is this politically motivated?
Is it, in your opinion?
I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not going to say for sure, but but supporters of the president certainly are alleging that.
Mm-hmm.
And then it goes back to a claim that was very successful for Mr. Trump that he made during the 2016 election, that there's been essentially a loss in our country of public trust in our institutions in terms of them being neutral. Trump's allegations were that the waters were muddied and that there were internal biases that have been in place in institutional politics in the United States and in the media for a long time.
Against him
and against certain points of view.
Like?
Oh, well, he's going to allege, that the conservative point of view has, in certain institutional areas, has been unfairly targeted,
mm-hmm.
and and they're not allowed to express their views. Those are his allegations,
mm-hmm.
and whether or not something like this potential indictment is essentially political and an exposition of that very claim.
I mean, other countries appear to do this quite regularly. In
Sure.
other words, prosecute a former leader,
Right.
a political leader like presidents, and this seems to happen everywhere. A lot of other places.
It happens in many other places. There's no real precedent for that happening here.
Never, right? Has
Correct.
there ever been a prosecution
Yeah.
of an ex-president?
Of an ex-president of the United States.
Right, for a crime.
For a crime.
Has it?
Not to my knowledge.
How is it used in other countries? This idea of prosecuting ex-presidents?
Well, it's often looked at as as motivated form of political revenge.
Why? I don't get it.
Well, to knock out the opposition and to
Forever?
Like potentially, sure.
Even after a victory?
Yes. to make sure that during the next election cycle, that prior administration, that prior president, man or woman, has no capacity to run again.
John, I got
Yeah,
okay, give us an example.
It's happened in Brazil. It's happened in Pakistan.
It did happen in Brazil, right?
That's correct.
President Lula
who is currently the sitting president,
right? But
who was elected.
how did that work when Bolsonaro was elected?
There were allegations of corruption against Lula,
the former president.
The former president
right.
at the time. I don't remember the exact allegations, but there was something to the effect that he took money to renovate his beach house that he had,
right.
and that he used contacts that he made in politics to get better deals to complete these renovations. He was prosecuted
and put in jail.
And he was put in jail.
Mm-hmm.
And then at some point, a federal jury in that country re-examined the facts and let him out early.
Mm-hmm.
And now he is supposedly he'd been exonerated subsequently, and now he's the sitting president who defeated Bolsonaro.
And many ex-presidents in other countries have to leave after they become the ex, correct?
That's correct.
Like, for instance, Bolsonaro himself, the former president of Brazil, now is in Florida.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't know if that is a legal requirement in Brazil
No,
that he
I
had
don't
to
think so.
leave.
No, of course no. They get chased out.
Or was he chased out, or does he just prefer to live in Florida? But I know in other countries that has been a recurring.
Talk a little bit about Pakistan, if you would, even though we don't want to pick on Pakistan.
Well, there's been some, there have been a couple of presidents in that country that, after their term ended or after they were defeated in an election, subsequently they had to leave the country because death sentences were put in place for them having been accused of crimes such as corruption.
So, in other words,
which they've argued against.
Right. So, in other words, the United States might be in danger of setting a precedent that ex-presidents are going to be prosecuted for crimes and perhaps put in jail as a political maneuver, correct?
Yeah, we need to have the conversation.
Yes.
We can't give them blanket immunity for whatever they do.
No,
we can't, as Trump once said, shoot someone on the middle of Fifth Avenue,
mm-hmm.
and people being okay with it. But I think we need to strike a balance
mm-hmm.
as to whether or not something is going to be politically motivated, as is being alleged here in the case of an affair that the president allegedly had, 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I'm using the term allegedly because I don't know that we know
mm-hmm.
what exactly transpired. But is that the best case for the opposition to potentially take someone out from being able to run again?
They tried to impeach him.
He was impeached
he
twice.
Was impeached, yeah.
He was impeached. He wasn't removed from office, but he was impeached. But at the end of the day, the allegations that were made during the course of the impeachment proceedings, those are not what are being contested right now.
Exactly.
We're coming down to an affair that the president had 20 years ago.
Or didn't.
Mm-hmm. And is that going to be the basis? Are we going to go after things where, legally, prosecutors have to perform, acrobatics, essentially, to try to put together a case
mm-hmm.
and really stretch,
mm-hmm.
which I think, the district attorney right now in the state of New York is putting himself in that potential position of really having to stretch to try to get the former president on something.
And so there might be a very unusual for the United States precedent being set that you can go after prior presidents because of politics, essentially.
Yeah.
And that is a dangerous precedent.
That is certainly a dangerous precedent.
To our country.
So,
it's never happened before.
Right. And I think, we need to have we need to have a dialogue
yes.
about this.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not we as a people, as a country, feel comfortable with doing that
mm-hmm.
when there isn't, in what the average person's mind is, a clear, convincing felony or crime that's been committed.
Okay.
Like murder, like rape, like
Right.
theft,
Right.
in the average person's mind.
And this might be simply a non-disclosure agreement.
Well, yeah, it wasn't handled that way.
Right.
It was done in a more surreptitious, dubious manner, but essentially that's what it was.
To keep her.
To keep someone quiet, discussing details about a sexual
Right.
relationship that was consensual, potentially.
Okay, Kurt, any final questions from anyone? No? Okay. Thank you very much. We'll be together again, I hope.
We'll see
Next
what
time.
happens, if the president is indeed indicted.
I believe there's so much controversy in the grand jury that it might not happen. I'm hoping it doesn't happen. Get them on something real.
Right.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for
Thanks,
being
Sandy.
here.
Thanks for
Joining
having me.
Vicky, and we'll see you in a month or so. Thank you.